Hi everyone, this is Selena Kraus for Picket Studio and welcome to another creative video. Today I'll be sharing with you a technique how to make a super fun watercolor galaxy background to use as a backdrop on your cards. So here's the sample that we'll create today. I'm using the new Capricorn Girl Stamp Set, which fits perfectly for A2 cards, and this background is perfect backdrop for it. So let's get started. Here is the stamp set that I will be using, the Capricorn Girl. I have some cold press watercolor paper, masking tape, sea salt, rubbing alcohol, white gel pen. I have few jars of water. I have 2 jars that are filled with clean water, and I have an empty jar that I'll use to put the rubbing alcohol in. I'm using 91% rubbing alcohol, but you can go also with 70%. It will work. I have my paint brushes. I'll be using those for watercoloring, not the rubbing alcohol. So I have also a wooded a block here that I will use to secure my watercolor paper so it stays nice and flat. So the Capricorn Girl fits in a portrait position on A2 card. So I turned my watercolor paper, which measures 5 by 7, so we're going to trim it when we're done with this background. I'm just taping that nicely and securely to my wood block, or you can use, it's more like a wood board. You can use also old cutting board that will serve the purpose as well, or you can just tape it down to your work surface. I like to use wood board so I can move it around. So also I have my watercolors here. I'm just putting, because they're dry, I'm putting some water to reactivate those so I can work easily with them. We're gonna do wet on dry technique, which means that we're going to apply color directly onto dry watercolor paper. Here on the side, I'm swatching my colors because I lost my palette to see my little color swatches to see which color actually, which little paint pot, which color it is. So let's get started. I'm starting with black here. I know this may scare you right away to apply black on your paper. But don't worry, we're going to apply other colors and they will all blend together. Next, I'm applying very dark blue, and I'm going more towards teal blue. I'm adding some pink, so you can see how those colors lighten up. Now I'm doing a technique which is called drop and release. I'm picking up paint with my brush and I'm just touching that wet paint. While the paint is wet, not very wet and not dry, it's still kind of glossy, I'm adding the sea salt. I'm using a fine sea salt, but you can use more coarse sea salt for larger, for more texture. What I'm doing here now is I added some alcohol in my jar, and I'm using a brush that I don't use for anything else. I'm using the alcohol and I just touch that wet paint and you will see how those little white dots, like that alcohol is pushing the paint to the sides wherever like it spreads, it's pushing the paint and it creates little halos for our stars. So once I have that done, I'm applying more paint and you will see the first area had already dried, but we're gonna soften those edges once one area is dry, and when you start applying paint to different area, it can create very harsh lines. But I'm doing that drop and release technique on those edges, so it smoothens out those harsh edges. I'm going in sections here because it's still pretty hot and the paint dries pretty quick. So I want to apply that salt and alcohol while the paint is not completely dry. We will have that glossy, kind of shiny look of the paint. So I'm repeating again, I added just salt. I'm not removing the salt yet. And now I'm adding little drops of alcohol. And you can see how those areas start to lighten up. Next, I'm continuing to paint the third and last area. Depending where you live or the temperature in your room or the size of your paper, you may need to just do this even like 4 times or just 2 or 1. It depends how fast that paint is drying. So you can see in the middle there I have harsh line between the green and the dark blue, but we're gonna soften that just in a second. Just adding more paint. I'm making this a little bit darker. So now I'm adding like drop and release from that bright green along those harsh edges, so that softens it up. I'm also adding again salt, and all that texture kind of makes it all blend together and those harsh edges disappear. I'm adding again the little alcohol drops, and I'm adding here just plain clean water. Again, I'm doing the drop and release. I just touch it with my brush and I move the brush away. So that creates even more texture. That water is pushing the paint to the side. It's not like the alcohol effect, but it creates more softer look than the alcohol. Okay, now I used my heat tool to dry this background, or you can set it aside and let it dry on its own. I'm usually impatient and I want to continue working, so I dried it with the heat gun. I have my towel here that I use to clean my stamps or my surface. I'm just rubbing that background to remove all the salt. Since we're gonna stamp on this background, I didn't want any salt particles to be left there. I want it to be nice and smooth. So use that towel to kind of polish it up or remove all the salt. Next, I have 3 different white gel pens. They have different thickness, and I'll use those to add stars onto my background, just little white dots. I'm also adding white dots to the little halos that were created using the alcohol. So you can see here how that galaxy background is starting to shape up. Those white dots, I think they add a lot of interest and creates for a fun background. So I had a piece of cardstock to my left just to test the pens before I go directly onto my background. Just I'm adding little lines of dots for a little bit more interest and texture. Usually I add those lines along where we have one color moving to another, or where we had those harsh lines that we tried to soften. That adds a little bit, makes it even less visible. So we're almost finishing up here. Okay, I think I'm satisfied with the result. Now I'm just using a few of my colored pencils to add little colors around those, in the halos around those stars. A little bit more interest and color to those stars. Okay, I have the background done now. Now it's time to stamp the image and the sentiment. So I'm using my Misty tool and I'm positioning that Capricorn girl and the sentiment to see the placement. So once I'm satisfied, I'm removing the sentiment, and first I will just stamp the image. Before I go on to stamping, I will grab my embossing powder and test it over the background. So it stuck to my background, which meant my background is not completely dry. So I don't want to stamp on it if it's not completely dry, because that white embossing powder is gonna stick everywhere. So now that I dried it again using my heat tool, I put it back in the MISTI. I applied anti-static powder, and I'm stamping a few times using Versamark, or you can use any embossing or sticky ink. I stamped several times because this background is done on cold pressed watercolor paper, which has a little bit more texture. And also we had already salt applied and other stuff on this background. So I wanted to make sure that the image had nice coverage of that embossing ink on it. Okay, I heat set it to melt that embossing powder. I'm putting it back in my MISTI and stamping it one more time. This will create more more intense white image and a little bit more raised than with just one layer of embossing powder. Okay, now we are done with the image, and we're gonna stamp a sentiment from the same stamp set. This is the description of the zodiac sign Capricorn. So I'm stamping it again several times in my MISTI tool using Versamark ink, and I'm applying detailed white embossing powder. Now I melted the embossing powder, and now it's time to start putting together our card. I'm using a few layers of cardstock, some scrap cardstock, heavyweight that I had, instead of using foam tape or foam craft foam. This will add a little bit more dimension and help that watercolor background stay straight. The watercolor paper tends to wrap when you apply a lot of paint or water, so this will keep it straight. So I added something heavy on top, my mistis, and let it dry. So applying something heavy, adding something heavy on top allows that watercolor paper to straighten up and stay straight. To finish off the card, I'm just adding that panel onto a top folding white note card. And then for a little bit more texture, because this could be a one layer card, but I just wanted to add a little bit more texture and interest. I'm using the new Iridescent Moonshine Sequin mix. So I'm adding little drops of liquid glue, very strong liquid glue, and adding those sequins around the image. So besides the stars, they add a little bit more shine and sparkle to our background. I'll add a couple more here. And this finishes our card for today and our technique for today. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching this video. I hope you're gonna give this technique a try. Also, please don't forget to subscribe to the Picket Fans YouTube channel. Also visit our blog for more ideas and more inspiration. Thanks for watching. Bye!